Far above the blue and white curve of Earth, a fleet of gray warships hung in silent rows. They did not move. They did not fire. They simply watched, the way a hunter watches a sleeping animal, before deciding how to kill it. The fleet belonged to the Varath Assembly, a union of 11 starfaring species that had spread across 1,000 solar systems. The Assembly did not conquer worlds with wild violence. It did things the proper way, the legal way, the way that let its members sleep at night. First it sent scout ships, then it sent surveyors, then it sent a council of judges who looked at a planet and decided, calmly and without anger, whether that planet's people deserved to keep their world. Earth had failed that judgment 2 years ago. Now the fleet had come to collect what the judges said belonged to the Assembly. Fleet Admiral Corvain Thess stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Judgment of Vithari, and studied the images on the main screen. Blue oceans, green land, small cities glowing at night like scattered coins. No orbital defense platforms, no warships in high orbit, no signs of directed energy weapons on the surface. His scanners, some of the finest instruments the Assembly had ever built, found nothing that could threaten a single one of his ships, let alone the 4,000 vessels waiting behind him. "Report," Thess said. His voice was calm, almost bored. He had done this 11 times before, on 11 other worlds. Every time, the process was the same. Every time, the natives cried and begged, and sometimes fought with sticks and stones. And every time, the Assembly took what it needed and moved on. A younger officer named Sella Wren answered from her station. She was Farai, a species with pale blue skin and large black eyes built for reading starlight. She had studied Earth for 6 months before this mission, more than anyone else on the ship. "Admiral, the planet shows no organized military presence beyond small arms and short-range aircraft," she said. "Their most advanced weapons are chemical rockets, the same technology we cataloged 80 years ago, when the first automated probe passed through this system. There is no evidence of energy shielding, no evidence of faster-than-light travel, and no evidence of orbital industry. By every measure the Assembly uses, this species qualifies as Tier 1, defenseless." "Tier 1, Thess repeated. He allowed himself the smallest smile. Tier 1 worlds were the easiest. No need for a long siege, no need for careful negotiation. The Assembly's law was simple on this point. If a species could not defend its world in space, that world's resources belonged to whoever could take them. It was not cruelty. It was, in the Assembly's own words, the natural order of a civilized galaxy. "Then we proceed as planned," Thess said. "Send the declaration." Sella's fingers moved across her console, and a message went out from the Judgment of Vithari on every frequency the humans were known to use. It was translated automatically into the planet's major languages, its tone smooth and official, the kind of voice used by beings who had done this many times and felt no need to raise it. The message reached Earth in less than a second. It reached radios in New York, television stations in Tokyo, government bunkers in Moscow, London, Beijing, and 1,000 smaller places in between. "People of Earth," the voice said, "this system has been surveyed and classified under Assembly Directive 7. Your species has been found, without adequate means to defend your world from orbital claim. Under the law of the Varath Assembly, this world and its resources are hereby declared open for annexation. You are given 48 hours to gather your populations into designated zones for processing. Resistance is not advised. Resistance changes nothing except the manner of your surrender." Across the planet, screens went dark, then came back on with news anchors trying to keep their voices steady. Crowds gathered in city squares, looking up at a sky that seemed the same as it always had, except that everyone now knew something enormous was floating above the clouds, waiting. In an underground command center 300 meters below the Colorado Mountains, a very different reaction was taking place. General Marcus Webb sat at the head of a long table filled with officers, scientists, and a few people whose job titles did not appear on any public document. The wall screens showed the same alien message playing over and over, translated and retranslated, analyzed for any hidden meaning. Nobody in the room looked afraid. A few of them looked almost relieved. 48 hours, said a woman near the end of the table. Her name was Dr. Amara Osei, and she had spent the last 30 years of her life working on something the rest of the world did not know existed. "That's more time than we expected them to give us. They think we're helpless," Webb said. They think 48 hours is generous because they don't think we can do anything with it. Good, said another officer, a stern man named Colonel Ilya Rask. Let them keep thinking that. Webb looked at the faces around the table. Some of these people had been part of this project since before he was born. It had started in the deserts of Nevada and the frozen coasts of Norway, in the years after a strange metal object had been found buried under 200 meters of Antarctic ice, a wrecked scout ship from a species nobody on Earth had ever met. That ship had been the first proof that humanity was not alone, and it had also been proof of something far more frightening, that whoever built that ship had been searching for something on Earth, and had likely never gone home to report what they found. The scientists who studied that wreck for the next 4 decades had learned 2 things. First, that the technology inside it was advanced beyond anything human industry could build from scratch. Second, that pieces of it could be reverse-engineered, slowly, carefully, one system at a time, if the work was kept secret from the rest of the world, and, more importantly, from the stars. So the world's governments, in a rare moment of true cooperation hidden behind decades of public rivalry, had built something enormous in silence. Not a fleet sitting in orbit where alien scanners could count it. Not a handful of warships parked on the moon. Something else. Something the Assembly's scanners, built to detect starship engines and energy shielding and orbital industry, were never designed to find. Status of the Hive Network, Webb said. A young engineer named Priya Nandan pulled up a new map on the main screen. It showed the Earth in cross-section, with thousands of small red points scattered across every continent and beneath every ocean. Some were under mountains. Some were beneath the deep-sea floor. Some were hidden inside cities so ordinary that even the people living above them had no idea what slept beneath their basements and subway tunnels. All primary sites report full readiness, Priya said. 94% of secondary sites are also green. We have been running silent diagnostics for 6 years without a single detectable power signature reaching the surface. As far as their scanners are concerned, none of this exists. And the ships themselves? Webb asked. Built, tested, and sealed, said Colonel Rask. Every hull, every drive core, every weapon system, copied and improved from the Antarctic wreck and the 2 others we recovered since. 12,000 vessels, ready for immediate launch. Another 8,000 in various stages of completion that we can bring online within the week if needed. 12,000 ships. Nobody at that table said the number out loud very often, because it still felt unreal, even to the people who had spent their careers building it. 12,000 ships hidden inside a planet that an alien fleet admiral, at that very moment, was calling defenseless. Dr. Osei folded her hands on the table. There's something else you all need to remember before we move forward, she said. This isn't really our fleet, not originally. The core technology came from a species that built that wrecked scout ship, a species we have never met, and know almost nothing about, except that whatever found them before we did was terrifying enough that their own ship crashed here trying to escape something. We built on top of their leftover war machine. We don't know what we might be waking up by using it. We'll deal with that problem when it comes, Webb said. Right now we have a more immediate one hanging over our heads, literally. He turned to the main screen, where the message from the Judgment of Vithari was still looping. They gave us 48 hours, Webb said. We are not going to spend those hours gathering into zones for processing. We are going to spend them finishing our final checks, positioning every ship in this network for a coordinated launch, and preparing every single door on this planet to open at the exact same moment. And if they attack before the 48 hours are up? Someone asked. Then we launch early, Webb said, but I don't think they will. Everything we've learned about the Assembly says they follow their own rules, with almost religious discipline. They believe in their process. They believe a Tier 1 world poses no danger, and they will wait out their own deadline, because doing anything else would mean admitting they might be wrong. That belief is the only advantage we have left, and we are going to use every second of it. Far above, in the cold quiet of orbit, Admiral Thess had no idea that his patience, the very thing that made the Assembly's conquest of 1,000 worlds so orderly and efficient, was about to become the greatest mistake of his career. He walked to the observation window of the Judgment of Vithari and looked down at Earth, turning slowly beneath him, blue and green and utterly silent. Somewhere down there, in cities he could not name, and among people he had already decided were beneath his notice, Engineers were running final checks on machines built from a dead species' broken dreams, and a planet full of people, who had grown up believing they were alone in the universe, were quietly preparing to prove 11 star systems worth of aliens catastrophically wrong. Sella, Thess said without turning from the window. Prepare the standard occupation protocols. I want landing teams ready the moment the deadline passes. Yes, Admiral, Sella said. Then, after a pause, she added, Sir, may I ask something? Go ahead. Doesn't it ever feel strange? How easy it always is. Thess considered the question for a long moment, watching the slow turn of the world below. Every species believes its world is special, until we prove otherwise, he said. This one will be no different. He did not know, as those words left his mouth, that beneath the calm blue surface of the planet, he had already judged and dismissed. Thousands of doors were beginning, very quietly, to unseal themselves. The countdown had begun. Not the Assembly's countdown, ticking down toward an ultimatum the humans had no intention of honoring. Earth's own countdown. Silent, patient, almost ready. 20 hours into the 48-hour deadline, the world above pretended to panic, while the world below prepared for war. On television, in every country, leaders gave speeches asking their people to remain calm, to gather supplies, to follow instructions from local authorities about where to assemble when the deadline arrived. Behind closed doors, those same leaders spoke on secure lines with General Webb and the small circle of people who knew the truth. The public panic was real. The plan behind it was theater, carefully staged to keep the Assembly convinced that Earth was exactly what its scanners said it was. A frightened, disorganized, defenseless world, with no options left but surrender. Admiral Thess found the whole spectacle a little dull. He had watched the same theater play out on 11 other worlds, though never one quite this populated, never one with quite so many separate nations, still arguing among themselves, even with a fleet of 4,000 warships parked above their heads. It amused him, in a distant way. It also made his work simpler. A species divided against itself rarely organized any real resistance. Radio chatter has increased across all bands, Sella reported from her station on the bridge. Emergency broadcasts, evacuation notices, some military movement, but nothing beyond what we would expect. Small arms redistribution, civil defense drills, no orbital activity of any kind. Naturally, Thess said. Continue standard monitoring. Flag anything unusual. What none of the Assembly's scanners could detect, because they had never been designed to look for it, was the enormous and silent work happening far beneath the planet's surface. In the Colorado Command Center, General Webb walked a narrow corridor deep beneath the mountain, following Dr. Osei toward a set of blast doors, marked only with a number. Beyond those doors lay one of the 12 primary shipyards, a cavern so large that its far wall could not be seen from the entrance, carved out over decades using excavation methods that themselves had been reverse-engineered from alien technology. Inside, arranged in long silent rows that stretched into darkness, sat starships. Not sleek and polished like something from an old film, but heavy, practical, built for one purpose. Their hulls were a dull gray-black material that absorbed light rather than reflecting it, a trick learned from the wreck that had started this entire project. Engineers in exosuits moved between them on suspended platforms, running final diagnostics, sealing the last few access panels, checking systems that had been checked 100 times before. How does it feel? Dr. Osei asked, watching Webb take in the sight. Feels like waiting for a surgery to start, Webb said. You've done everything you can to prepare, and now all that's left is to see if the patient survives. The patient is the whole planet this time. I'm aware. They walked further, past ship after ship, until they reached a viewing platform overlooking the largest vessel in the cavern, a command ship nearly 2 kilometers long, built around the recovered core of the original Antarctic wreck. Its outer hull had been rebuilt many times over the decades as engineers learned more, but its heart, the strange and still only partly understood engine at its center, was the very same one that had crashed into Earth's ice sheet more than 40 years ago. We call her the Vigil, Osei said. She's the only ship in our entire fleet that isn't a copy. She's the original, rebuilt around herself. If anyone out there ever recognizes that engine signature, they'll know exactly what we built our fleet from. Let's hope nobody out there is looking that closely, Webb said. They were interrupted by a soft chime from Osei's tablet. She read the message twice before speaking. Colonel Rask wants both of us in the strategy room, she said. He says the assembly fleet just changed formation. By the time they reached the strategy room, the wall screens were already filled with data streaming in from Earth's network of hidden sensors, instruments built into ordinary satellites and civilian communication arrays, disguised as harmless equipment, feeding raw information back to the command center, without ever transmitting anything that assembly scanners would recognize as military. They're not attacking, Rask said as Webb and Osei entered. They're repositioning, spreading their fleet out into a wider net around the planet, probably to make sure no evacuation ships try to slip away before the deadline. Standard assembly procedure, according to the files we pulled from the Rex data core all those years ago. So they're still following their own rules, Webb said. To the letter. It's almost comforting, in a strange way. Predictable enemies are easy enemies. Priya Nandan, seated at a console nearby, spoke up without looking away from her screen. General, I want to flag something. We've been running the numbers on their fleet composition, comparing it against everything we know from the recovered data. Their warships use energy signatures roughly 40% stronger than our best simulations predicted. Either the assembly has advanced significantly since the data we recovered was recorded, or the species that built our core technology was already behind the assembly, even back when their scout ship crashed here. The room went quiet for a moment. Meaning our ships might be facing an enemy stronger than we planned for, Webb said. Meaning we might be facing an enemy stronger than we planned for, Priya corrected gently. Our ships are strong. I'm not saying they're not. I'm saying the margin we expected to have going into this fight might be smaller than we hoped. Webb rubbed his eyes. 40 years of secrecy, decades of careful engineering, entire generations of scientists and soldiers who had given their whole working lives to a project most of them would never be allowed to speak about publicly. And now, with less than a day left before the ultimatum expired, they were learning the margin might not be as wide as they had believed. Options, he said simply. We stick to the plan, Rask said immediately. 12,000 ships against 4,000 is still 3-1 in our favor, even before accounting for the element of surprise. They don't know we exist. They don't know what's about to come up out of the ground and out of the ocean floor beneath their formation. Surprise alone might be worth more than the difference in raw power. Or, Osei said carefully, we consider whether there's still time to reach out, not to surrender, to talk. If their technology outpaces ours by a wider margin than we expected, a war we can't clearly win isn't a war worth starting if there's any other option. They already gave us their terms, Rask said. Surrender everything, or be taken by force. There is no version of talking to them that ends with humanity keeping this planet. Webb held up a hand before the argument could grow. He looked at the star map on the main screen, the 4,000 alien warships arranged in their patient, confident net around the Earth, and thought about the message that had been broadcast to the whole planet less than a day earlier. Resistance is not advised. Resistance changes nothing, except the manner of your surrender. We are not going to ask permission to keep our own world, Webb said finally. We built this fleet for exactly this moment. If it turns out we built it against an enemy stronger than we thought, then we adapt, we fight smarter, and we use every advantage we have, starting with the fact that they still believe we're helpless. That belief is worth more than 40% stronger engines. Let's make sure it stays that way until the last possible second. Nobody argued further. Even Osei, who had spent decades hoping this day might never come, understood that the choice had effectively been made the moment the assembly's ultimatum arrived. There was no peaceful path left. There was only the fight, and how well they prepared to meet it. Over the following hours, the command center became a quiet storm of final activity. Communication lines to world leaders carried updated instructions, coded within ordinary civil defense broadcasts, telling regional commanders exactly when and how their local portions of the Hive network would activate. Engineers ran one last diagnostic pass across every one of the 12,000 ready ships. Pilots, soldiers, and crew who had trained for this exact moment for years, some of them for their entire adult lives, made their way through hidden tunnels and elevators, down into the waiting hulls of their vessels, strapping into seats built for bodies that had never left Earth's gravity in anything faster than a commercial airliner. At the 36-hour mark, with 12 hours left before the assembly's deadline, Admiral Thess received a report that gave him his first and only moment of genuine curiosity since arriving in the system. "Admiral," Sella said, "we're detecting minor seismic activity at several dozen locations across the planet's surface. Nothing dangerous. The pattern is unusual, though. Too regular to be natural." Thess glanced at the readings on his console. Small vibrations, evenly spaced, appearing and disappearing at scattered points across every continent. "Analysis?" "Unknown, sir. Could be mining activity. Could be some kind of religious ritual. Some species do strange things when faced with extinction. Could be nothing at all. An artifact of our own sensors adjusting to atmospheric interference." Thess considered it for a moment, then dismissed it the way he had dismissed 100 small anomalies on 100 other worlds. A Tier 1 species, according to the Assembly's own careful and time-tested classification system, simply did not have the capability to hide anything meaningful from a fleet like his. The very idea was almost laughable. "Keep monitoring," he said, "nothing more." He turned back to the observation window, looking down at the blue and green world below, 12 hours from becoming the Assembly's latest acquisition. Beneath the ocean floor, near what the humans called Japan, a massive door built into the seabed had just completed its final pressure test. Beneath the deserts of Australia, an entire mountain range that appeared on every star chart as solid rock was quietly venting excess heat from reactor cores that had been running at low power for years, waiting. Beneath the ice of Antarctica itself, not far from where the very first wreck had been found decades ago, the largest shipyard on the planet stood ready, its doors sealed shut against a sky that still believed the world beneath it had nothing left to hide. 12 hours remained. Somewhere in that time, an admiral who had never lost a campaign would watch his careful, patient plan collide with a planet that had spent 40 years learning how to keep a secret from the stars themselves. The last hour before the deadline passed, in near total silence across the Colorado Command Center. Nobody spoke unless they had to. Every screen showed the same countdown, ticking down toward zero, toward the moment the Assembly's ultimatum would officially expire. General Webb stood in the center of the room, watching the numbers fall. 45 minutes. 30. 15. "All shipyards confirm ready status," Priyanandan said quietly. "All 12,000 primary vessels are manned, sealed, and holding at final launch positions. Door mechanisms across all sites report green across the board. Fleet formation for the moment of launch?" Webb asked. "As planned," Rask answered. "We come up beneath their formation, not in front of it. Their scanners are focused outward and around the planet, watching for anything trying to leave. They are not watching straight down into the ground or up from beneath the ocean floor, because as far as they know, there is nothing there to watch for." Webb nodded slowly. 40 years of work had led to this exact plan, built around one simple truth about how the Assembly operated. Their entire system of judging worlds relied on orbital and surface scans, on cataloging visible industry and visible fleets. They looked at what a planet showed them, not at what a planet could be hiding beneath its own crust. It was arrogance, built into their very law, the assumption that a Tier 1 world could never possess anything worth looking closely for. 10 minutes, Priya said. Webb walked to the comm station and picked up a handset connected to a line that ran, through a chain of secure relays, to the leaders of every nation on Earth who had been read into this project over the decades. His voice, when he spoke, carried the weight of every person alive on the planet, even though almost none of them would ever know his name. "This is General Webb," he said. "All units, all commands. This is not a drill. We launch on my mark, in exactly 10 minutes. Whatever your position, whatever your role, remember why we built this. We are not fighting for conquest. We are fighting to keep what is ours. Good luck to every one of you." He set the handset down and turned back to the countdown. Above the planet, on the bridge of the Judgment of Vithari, Admiral Thess watched the same countdown from the opposite side, though his displayed the Assembly's own deadline, rather than humanity's launch sequence. 2 minutes until the ultimatum expires, Sella reported. No sign of organized surrender gatherings at the designated processing zones. Human populations appear to be sheltering in place, rather than assembling as instructed. "Expected," Thess said. "Fear rarely follows instructions well. Prepare landing craft. The moment the deadline passes, we begin the collection process regardless of their cooperation. Yes, Admiral. Thess allowed himself a slow breath, the closest thing to satisfaction he permitted during an operation. 11 worlds before this one, and every single time, the ending was the same. Fear, chaos, and eventually, order restored under assembly control. He did not expect this world to be any different. Sella's console chimed with an alert, sharper and more urgent than the seismic anomalies from earlier. Admiral, I'm reading a massive spike in energy readings, she said, her voice losing some of its usual calm. Multiple locations, hundreds of them. It's coming from beneath the surface, across every continent, and from beneath several ocean floors as well. Thess turned sharply toward her station. Clarify. I don't have a clean read yet, it's happening too fast, but the pattern matches. Sella stopped, staring at her screen, as if she did not quite believe what it showed her. Admiral, it matches Starship reactor ignition signatures. Thousands of them, activating simultaneously. For the first time since arriving in the Sol system, Admiral Thess felt something he had not felt in decades of service to the Assembly. Uncertainty. That is not possible, he said. This world has no orbital industry. No detected shipyards. Our scans were thorough. Your scans looked at the sky, Admiral, Sella said, half to herself, half in genuine shock. Not underneath it. Beneath the surface of the Earth, in that same instant, 12,000 ships came alive. In the Colorado shipyard, the deep hum of reactor cores rose from a whisper to a roar. Overhead, an enormous door built into the mountainside, disguised for decades as a section of solid rock reinforced by nothing more exotic than a very convincing layer of stone composite, began to open. Sunlight poured into a cavern that had never seen it before, illuminating row after row of gray-black warships beginning to lift off their launch cradles. The same scene played out across the planet, all at once. In the deserts of Australia, sand shifted and cracked as hidden blast doors the size of city blocks swung upward, revealing shipyards buried since before some of the pilots inside them had been born. Beneath the Pacific Ocean, enormous seals broke apart along the ocean floor, sending walls of displaced water rushing outward as ships rose from beneath the waves into open air for the first time. In Antarctica, ice that had covered the surface for centuries cracked and shifted as the largest shipyard on the planet, built around the very wreck that had started this entire project 40 years earlier, opened its doors to the sky. Thousands of ships, not appearing from nowhere, not summoned by magic or miracle, but rising from beneath a planet that the Assembly's own laws had declared incapable of any such thing. On the bridge of the Judgment of Vithari, alarms began sounding across every station. Officers who had spent their careers processing calm, orderly conquests, now scrambled to understand a battlefield that had changed shape in a matter of seconds. Admiral, multiple contacts. I'm counting. I can't get an exact number. It's still rising, Sella said, her voice tight. We're past 3,000 individual vessel signatures. 4,000. Still climbing. Impossible, Thess said again, though the word carried less conviction each time he said it. He stared at the tactical display as it filled with red markers, more appearing every second, rising from beneath the planet's surface in every direction his fleet had spread itself to cover. Orders, Admiral? Sella asked. Thess forced himself to think clearly. Panic solved nothing. He had 4,000 warships, a fleet that had conquered 11 worlds without ever losing more than a handful of vessels in any single engagement. Whatever this species had managed to hide from his scanners, it did not change the fundamental math of warfare. Numbers and firepower still mattered. Full defensive formation, he ordered. All ships, prepare for engagement. Do not assume their vessels match our capability, simply because they achieved a surprise we failed to detect. Concentrate fire on the largest contacts first. Across the assembly fleet, 4,000 warships began shifting from their patient, spread-out watching positions into tighter defensive clusters, weapons charging, shields rising. It was the correct response, the disciplined response, exactly what decades of successful conquest had trained them to do. It was also, though none of them yet realized it, exactly the response the humans had spent years planning for. Below, in the strategy room deep under the Colorado mountains, General Webb watched the tactical display fill with green markers, representing humanity's rising fleet, spreading out to match the Assembly's own defensive shift. They're clustering, Rask said, studying the enemy formation. Trying to concentrate their firepower and support each other. Standard defensive doctrine. Which means? Webb asked, though he already suspected the answer. Which means they've made themselves a single, dense target, instead of 4,000 scattered ones, Rask said, something close to a grim smile crossing his face. Exactly what our formation was designed to punish. Webb looked at the display, at thousands of human ships rising from every corner of the planet, to meet an enemy that had called them defenseless less than 2 days earlier, and felt the weight of 40 years of secrecy finally begin to lift from his shoulders, replaced by something heavier and far more immediate. All ships, he said into the comm line, his voice steady despite everything. This is General Webb. The Assembly declared this world defenseless. They believed it enough to bring only 4,000 ships to take it. Let's show them exactly how wrong they were. Above the planet, the first shots of the battle for Earth had not yet been fired, but both fleets, one built over decades in secret, beneath a world it was sworn to protect, the other confident, from 11 easy conquests across 1,000 systems, now understood that whatever came next would be unlike anything either side had truly prepared for. The doors were open, the ships were in the sky, and for the first time in the Verith Assembly's long history of judging and taking, a Tier 1 world was about to fight back, with a fleet larger than the one sent to conquer it. The first exchange of fire lit up the space around Earth like a sudden, silent storm. Human ships, rising in tight coordinated groups from their launch points across the planet, met the Assembly's clustered defensive formation at the edge of low orbit. Weapons fire, brilliant streaks of energy in colors no human eye had ever seen outside of a simulation screen, crossed the darkness in both directions within seconds of the two fleets coming into range. Aboard the Vigil, the massive command ship built around the recovered core of the original Antarctic wreck, Colonel Rask stood at the tactical station, watching the battle unfold across a dozen screens at once. Beside him, General Webb had chosen to ride into the fight rather than direct it entirely from the safety of the underground command center, a decision he had made years earlier and never once reconsidered. Their formation is holding, Rask said, studying the enemy's tight defensive cluster. They're absorbing our opening volley better than projected, shields at 70% efficiency across their front line. Then we open the formation up, Webb said. Send the wing commanders the signal. Phase 2. Across the human fleet, ships that had launched in tight, disciplined groups now began to spread apart, breaking their own formation deliberately, surrounding the Assembly's dense cluster from multiple directions at once. It was a maneuver that would have been suicidal against a fleet with equal firepower and full awareness of the battlefield. Against an enemy that had spent the last 5 minutes reeling from the shock of discovering an entire hidden armada, it was devastating. Admiral, we're taking fire from multiple vectors, Sella reported from the bridge of the Judgment of Vithari, her voice tight with controlled urgency. Their ships have surrounded our formation. Shield efficiency dropping across the fleet, down to 50% and falling. Thess gripped the edge of his command console, watching his tactical display fill with warning markers. Every instinct honed over decades of successful campaigns told him this should not be happening. 4,000 disciplined warships, built by a species with centuries of starfaring experience, should not be losing ground to a fleet that, by every scan his ships had taken less than a day earlier, should not have existed at all. Analysis of their weapon systems, he demanded. Still compiling, Admiral, but preliminary data suggests their technology is... Sella hesitated. Their weapon signatures closely resemble something in our historical archives. Admiral, I believe their core technology derives from Cathari warfleet designs. The name hit Thess like a physical blow. The Cathari had been one of the most feared and most thoroughly destroyed species in the Assembly's long history, a civilization that had waged war against 3 separate star nations before finally being hunted to extinction nearly 2 centuries ago. Their remaining technology was considered so dangerous that Assembly law required any recovered fragment to be destroyed on discovery. Not studied, not reverse-engineered. Destroyed. That's impossible, Thess said. The Cathari were exterminated generations before this system was ever surveyed. Impossible or not, Admiral, the energy signatures match within a 91% confidence interval, Sella said. Someone on this planet found Cathari technology, and they built an entire fleet from it. Below, unaware of the historical weight their salvaged wreck carried among the stars, Human pilots fought a battle built on decades of careful preparation, and, though they did not know it, a foundation of alien engineering feared by an empire far older than their own. In the cockpit of a mid-sized human cruiser called the Resolute, Captain Elena Reyes guided her ship through a gap in the assembly formation, weapons firing in short, precise bursts at an enemy destroyer that had strayed too far from its cluster's support. She had trained for this exact scenario for 6 years, running simulations built from data recovered from 3 separate alien wrecks, learning to fight an enemy she had never met, using tactics designed by scientists who had spent their careers studying salvaged war machines. Direct hit, her weapons officer called out. Enemy destroyer disabled, drifting. Good. Don't stop to admire it, Reyes said. Regroup with second wing. Target their supply cluster next. Across the battlefield, similar scenes repeated themselves hundreds of times over. Human ships, smaller in number than they had once hoped but larger than the assembly fleet by a wide margin, used speed and coordination to pick apart an enemy formation that had been built for a very different kind of war, one against species that fought with far less unity and far less patience. 40 minutes into the battle, the assembly fleet's tight defensive cluster had become a scattered mess of damaged and disabled vessels, its once orderly formation broken apart by an enemy that refused to fight the way 11 previous conquered worlds had fought. Admiral, we've lost contact with nearly 600 vessels, Sella reported, her voice now carrying open alarm rather than professional calm. Fleet cohesion is failing. Multiple commanders are requesting permission to break formation and retreat toward the outer system. Thess stared at the tactical display, watching decades of unbroken success unravel in less than an hour. He thought of the message he had sent less than 2 days earlier, the calm, confident declaration that had gone out to every radio and screen on the planet below. Resistance is not advised. Resistance changes nothing except the manner of your surrender. He had believed those words completely when he spoke them. He was no longer certain of anything. Concentrate remaining ships around the judgment of Vithari, he ordered. We fall back to a tighter formation and hold position until we can properly assess. Admiral, incoming contact, directly ahead, Sella interrupted, her eyes wide as a new marker appeared on the tactical display, larger than anything else in the battle, moving directly toward the flagship with clear and deliberate intent. The Vigil emerged from the chaos of smaller ships like a mountain rising from a stormy sea, its dark hull catching what little light the battle provided, its weapons already charging. Aboard the Vigil, General Webb watched the assembly flagship grow larger on his main screen, close enough now to make out the details of its hull, an enemy vessel that had crossed unknown distances of space to declare an entire planet defenseless. Colonel, status of their flagship's shields. Down to 30% and dropping, Rask confirmed. Whatever their fleet was built to handle, it wasn't a coordinated strike from a ship built around a Cathari core. Webb allowed himself a single, tired breath. 40 years of secrecy, sacrifice, and quiet, unglamorous work had led to this exact moment, a moment none of the original engineers, who had first opened that wrecked scout ship in the Antarctic ice, could have fully imagined when they began. Target their weapon systems and engines only, Webb said. Not their command sections. I want that ship disabled, not destroyed. We need answers more than we need another kill. Understood, Rask said, relaying the order. The Vigil fired a concentrated volley, aimed with surgical precision at the judgment of Vithari's primary weapon batteries and engine cluster. The assembly flagship shuddered under the impact, its shields collapsing entirely along its rear section, secondary explosions rippling across its hull as critical systems failed one after another. On the bridge of the dying flagship, alarms blared from every station. Sella struggled to maintain her console as sparks fell from an overhead panel damaged by the strike. Admiral, weapons offline. Main engines offline. We are dead in the water, she reported, fighting to keep her voice steady. Life support and secondary systems still functioning. We are completely at their mercy. Thess stood very still amid the chaos of his failing bridge, staring at the tactical display where the remains of his once proud fleet scattered in retreat around him, chased by an enemy his own scans had assured him could not exist. Fewer than half of his original 4,000 ships remained combat-capable. The rest drifted disabled, destroyed, or fled toward the edge of the system, in a retreat no assembly commander had ever been forced to order before. "Open a channel to the lead enemy vessel," he said quietly. A moment later, the image of General Marcus Webb appeared on the flagship's main screen, a tired, weathered human face, looking back at an alien admiral for the first time in either species' history. "Admiral Thess," Webb said, his voice carrying no triumph, only exhausted resolve. "You gave my planet 48 hours to surrender. I believe that deadline has passed." Thess said nothing for a long moment, studying the face on his screen, searching for something he could understand about a species that had hidden an entire war fleet beneath a world he had judged defenseless without a second thought. "How?" he finally said, the question carrying the weight of everything he no longer understood about the galaxy he had spent his life serving. "How does a Tier 1 world hide 12,000 ships from assembly scanners?" Webb's expression did not change. "Maybe it's time your assembly updated its definition of Tier 1, he said. "Your fleet is beaten, Admiral. I'm offering you the chance to surrender your remaining ships and end this without further losses on either side. What happens after that is a conversation for people with more authority than either of us." Somewhere behind Thess, Sela watched the exchange in stunned silence, still trying to process how completely her world's understanding of this mission, and perhaps of the entire galaxy beyond it, had just been shattered in less than an hour of battle above a planet the Assembly had called defenseless. Admiral Thess surrendered 11 hours after his flagship lost power. Once it became clear that no rescue would come, and no further resistance would change the outcome, already written across the wreckage scattered through Earth's orbit. Of the 4,000 ships that had arrived to claim a defenseless world, fewer than 900 remained combat-capable, and those that did retreated to the edge of the solar system rather than continue a fight they could no longer win. The human fleet did not pursue them. General Webb had given clear orders before the battle even began: disable, capture, or force a retreat, but do not chase a beaten enemy into deep space, where the fight might drag on far longer than necessary. Earth had won the battle it needed to win. It had no interest in starting a war of extermination against an empire it had only just learned existed. 3 days after the battle ended, the Judgment of Vithari sat disabled in high orbit, its damaged hull surrounded by a loose ring of human warships standing watch. Aboard it, Admiral Thess waited in what had once been his private quarters, now effectively a cell, for a meeting he had requested through Sela, the only officer he trusted to speak clearly with the humans on his behalf. The doors opened, and General Webb entered, accompanied by Dr. Amara Osei and a translator device that rendered his words into the Assembly's common trade language almost instantly. "Admiral," Webb said, taking a seat across from him without ceremony. "General," Thess replied. He studied the human for a long moment before continuing. "I have spent 3 days composing the report I will need to send back to Assembly Command, explaining how a Tier 1 world defeated a conquest fleet of 4,000 ships. I confess I still do not have an explanation that satisfies me." "Would it help to know the truth?" Webb asked. Thess considered this, then nodded slowly. "It would help more than continuing to guess." Webb glanced at Dr. Osei, who took over the explanation. She spoke plainly, without embellishment, describing the wrecked scout ship found beneath Antarctic ice more than 40 years earlier, the decades of secret work that followed, the slow and careful reconstruction of technology, from a species called the Cathari, a name that made Thess visibly tense the moment he heard it. "You built your fleet from Cathari wreckage," Thess said when she finished. "Do you understand what that means? The Cathari were exterminated because their war technology was judged too dangerous for any civilization to possess. Entire star nations died fighting them before they were finally destroyed." "We didn't know that when we started," Osei said honestly. "We knew we'd found something advanced, something that had crashed here running from someone or something. We built on it because we were afraid of exactly what happened 2 days ago, a fleet like yours arriving one day and finding us with nothing to defend ourselves. And now the Assembly will learn that a fragment of Cathari technology survived, hidden on an unlisted world, developed into a fleet capable of defeating 4,000 warships," Thess said quietly. "That knowledge alone will change how every species in the Assembly views this system, whether your people wish it to or not." Webb leaned forward. "Then let's make sure what they learn next is accurate. We are not the Cathari, Admiral. We didn't build this fleet to conquer other worlds. We built it because your Assembly's own scouts taught us, decades ago, exactly what happens to worlds that can't defend themselves. We simply decided not to be one of them. A long silence settled over the room. Outside the viewport, Earth turned slowly below them, blue and green, and, for the first time in its history, visibly capable of defending itself to any species that might be watching. "What happens now?" Tess finally asked. "I am your prisoner. My fleet is beaten. What does your species intend to do with what remains of us?" "You're going home," Webb said. "You and every surviving member of your fleet. We're not interested in becoming conquerors ourselves, but you're going to carry a message back to your assembly, and I want to make sure it's clear. Earth is no longer available for the kind of judgment your Directive 7 describes. We are not a resource to be claimed. If your assembly wants to establish contact with us in the future, it will happen as equals, through negotiation, not through ultimatums and 48-hour deadlines." Tess studied the human general for a long moment, weighing the offer against everything he had believed about the galaxy before arriving in this system. "The assembly does not easily accept being told no," he said. "There will be those in command who see this defeat, not as a reason for caution, but as a reason to return with greater force. Then they'll find the same fleet waiting for them," Webb said. "Bigger. By the time they get here. We've had this technology for 6 years. We're not finished learning what it can do." Something in Thess's expression shifted. Not quite respect, but something close to it. The beginning of an understanding that the being sitting across from him was not the desperate, frightened representative of a defeated species he had expected, but something else entirely. "I will carry your message," Thess said finally. "Whether Assembly Command chooses to heed it is beyond my control. But I will tell them the truth of what happened here, exactly as it happened, without exaggeration or excuse. Perhaps that honesty will serve your people better than either of us expects." 2 weeks later, the remains of the Vareth Assembly fleet departed the Sol system, their damaged ships limping toward the edge of human-controlled space, under careful escort, before being released to make their own way home. Admiral Thess stood on the bridge of his crippled flagship one final time, watching Earth shrink behind him, and found himself thinking not of the defeat he would have to explain to his superiors, but of the strange, quiet resolve he had seen in General Webb's eyes during their final conversation. Back on Earth, the aftermath of the battle unfolded very differently from anything the world's governments had planned for during 40 years of secrecy. The truth could no longer be hidden, not with wreckage from an alien fleet scattered across Earth's orbit, and 12,000 human warships now visible to anyone who looked up at the right moment. Within days, every government on the planet was forced to explain, in broad terms, what had been built beneath their feet for the last 4 decades. The public reaction was not what anyone had expected. There was anger, certainly, at the scale of the secrecy, at generations of taxpayers who had unknowingly funded a project none of them had been told about. But beneath the anger ran something stronger, relief, and a strange, unfamiliar pride. The species that had spent its entire recorded history looking up at the stars and wondering if anyone was out there, now knew, with absolute certainty, that they were not only not alone, but that they had met their first true test among the stars, and had not simply survived it. They had won it. In the weeks that followed, General Webb found himself, somewhat reluctantly, thrust into a role far beyond military command, serving as one of the primary voices explaining humanity's new place in a galaxy that suddenly felt much smaller and much more dangerous than it had 2 months earlier. He spent long hours in meetings with world leaders, scientists, and representatives from nations who had never before been read into the project, all of them trying to understand what came next, for a planet that had just announced its existence to the stars in the most dramatic way possible. Dr. Osei continued her work in the quiet corners of the project, now expanded far beyond its original secret budget, studying the captured wreckage from the assembly fleet alongside the original Cathari technology that had started everything. There was still so much they did not understand, about the Cathari, about the assembly, about whatever greater dangers might exist further out among the stars, that had made a species like the Cathari worth exterminating in the first place. Late one evening, months after the battle, Webb stood once again on the observation deck of the Vigil, looking out at the same starry darkness that had once hidden an entire fleet's arrival above his unsuspecting world. Priya Nandan joined him quietly, carrying 2 cups of coffee, an ordinary gesture that felt strange against the backdrop of everything that had changed. "Command wants to know if we should start expanding the shipyards," she said, handing him one of the cups. Word is starting to spread through unofficial channels. Other species out there have heard what happened here. Some of them are curious. A few of them, according to the trade signals we've started intercepting, are afraid. Webb took a slow sip of his coffee, thinking of Admiral Thess's parting words, the warning that the Assembly did not easily accept being told no. Expand them, he said, quietly, if we can manage it, though I suspect those days are mostly behind us now. The galaxy knows we're here. We might as well make sure that whatever comes next, we're ready for it. Below them, Earth turned slowly in the dark, no longer a hidden, unremarkable world, waiting to be judged and taken by whoever happened to notice it first, but something new, a planet that had opened its doors once, and would not hesitate to open them again. Far beyond the edge of the solar system, aboard a limping, half-destroyed flagship making its long journey home, Admiral Thess composed the final lines of his report to Assembly Command, choosing his words with the same careful discipline that had guided his entire career. Reclassify the Sol system immediately, he wrote. The species designated Tier 1 at this location is nothing of the sort. Recommend extreme caution in any future contact. They call their planet Earth. I recommend the Assembly remember that name, and remember what happened the day we called it defenseless.